Everyone thought it would be just another political hearing, until Karoline pulled out a single page, read it aloud, and left the entire room staring at Justice Barrett in stunned silence. The air inside room 2141 of the Rayburn House office building was thick, not with noise, but with something heavier. Anticipation, resignation, a collective awareness that something was about to give. The oversight hearing on judicial transparency had dragged on for nearly 4 hours. Most lawmakers had defaulted to routine talking points. A few journalists near the back had already started typing up their stories, assuming there'd be nothing new to report. That's when Karoline Leavitt asked to speak again. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't preface her words with warnings or accusations. She just adjusted her microphone, tapped once to make sure it was live, and calmly said, "I'd like to revisit the July 14th communications between Justice Amy Coney Barrett and Executive Director Philip Roche of the Nashville Pharma Council." The room paused. Not stopped. Paused. You could hear the shift. The shuffle of paper slowed. The clacking of keyboard keys ceased. Someone from Barrett's legal team scribbled something fast. Justice Barrett, seated calmly at the witness table in her formal robe, tilted her head slightly. Not confused, not concerned, but clearly alert. "I'm unaware of any direct communication on that date," she replied, her voice practiced and steady. Karoline nodded, just once, like she was confirming a hunch. "That's interesting because I have a record here, an internal log from Nashville Pharma's own visitor access sheet showing you entered their Bethesda office that afternoon at 3:12 p.m. and left shortly after 5. Barrett blinked. "That's incorrect. I've never visited their office. I believe there's been a mistake." Karoline leaned forward, unfazed. She pulled a folder from her briefcase and flipped it open with a quiet but deliberate motion. "This document was provided to my office last Thursday by an anonymous source within the company. It includes a sign-in sheet, security logs, and a photo time-stamped at 4:03 p.m. It shows you in the boardroom with Mr. Roche and 3 other Nashville executives. Would you like to see it?" No one in the room breathed. Barrett didn't take the offered papers. She didn't look at them. She adjusted her posture. "I don't recognize those materials," she said, her voice lower now, slower. Karoline didn't back down. She kept her tone even. "Justice, this committee is not accusing you of anything, yet, but we are here to investigate patterns of influence, and this looks like a pattern." One of Barrett's aides stood up quickly, whispering something to the committee chair, but the chair just shook his head and gestured for Leavitt to continue. He, too, looked pale now. A reporter in the gallery clicked her pen. Someone near the back dropped a water bottle and let it roll across the floor. Still, Karoline didn't rush. She turned to the screen behind her, motioned to staff, and a set of emails appeared, subject lines only, between Barrett's Family Foundation and a PAC partially funded by Nashville Pharma. The dates matched a 3-week period leading up to the court's 5-4 decision on Schroeder versus FDA, a case where the ruling directly shielded pharmaceutical manufacturers from certain liabilities. "Justice Barrett, did you or anyone in your immediate family discuss this case or any legal matter with representatives of Nashville Pharma during this period?" Barrett didn't answer right away. She stared at the emails on the screen. Her hand touched her pen, but she didn't write. "I've always upheld the ethical standards of this court," she said finally. "I won't respond to innuendo." Karoline paused. Let the silence hang a moment. She didn't look angry. She looked calm, almost disappointed. "This isn't innuendo. These are documented meetings, undisclosed donations, and now direct contradictions to your sworn testimony." And then, with perfect timing, Karoline lifted a single sheet of paper and held it up. "I haven't even read the internal memo yet, the one that details what was discussed in that meeting, word for word, but I will, in this room." But before she could turn the page, someone in the back whispered, "Is this real?" The question didn't need an answer. Everyone already felt it. Karoline Leavitt didn't rise through politics by playing it safe. She didn't charm rooms or sell easy lines. What she did was show up prepared, always. And for anyone who had followed her career, today's moment felt less like a surprise and more like a long time coming. A few years back, she was just another press secretary, sharp, opinionated, young. Too young, some said, but she had this thing about her. She listened. While others scrambled for headlines, Karoline stayed quiet, gathering facts. She remembered things people hoped would be forgotten: names, dates, contradictions, and when she ran for Congress, voters noticed. She wasn't flashy, she was precise. That mattered now more than ever, because this wasn't about scoring points or playing to the camera. This was about power, the kind most people don't see, the kind that moves behind closed doors and smiles politely when caught. The pharmaceutical industry had spent years cultivating its connections across both parties through think tanks, nonprofits, advisory boards, quiet influence, legal influence, influence that didn't leave fingerprints but changed lives. That's why the Schroeder v. FDA case had been such a lightning rod. At the center was a drug, Rividine. Marketed as a breakthrough anti-inflammatory, it had been rushed through an emergency approval window during a chaotic post-pandemic stretch. Within months, patients were reporting everything from cognitive side effects to liver damage. Lawsuits mounted, but when they reached the Supreme Court, the majority sided with the FDA and pharma companies, citing immunity protections during public health emergencies. Barrett wrote the opinion, short, tight, unapologetic. It raised eyebrows, not because of what it said, but because of what it didn't say. There was no mention of Rividine's adverse reports, no acknowledgement of whistleblower complaints, no consideration of the unusually fast approval timeline. Karoline didn't forget that. In the months after the ruling, she quietly started making calls. Not dramatic ones, just patient, careful outreach. A former Nashville pharma consultant, a hospital administrator in Fort Worth, a legal analyst who flagged inconsistencies in the court's written opinion. Then came the file. It arrived unannounced, late one evening, in an unmarked envelope at Karoline's district office in Manchester, New Hampshire. Inside were redacted documents, photos, and a handwritten note. If this hearing means anything, read page 9 aloud. She didn't know who sent it, but she'd seen enough to know the risks. This wasn't about politics anymore. This was about trust, judicial trust. The kind people are supposed to have when a judge puts on that robe and says they serve the law, not donors, not corporations, not friends. So when Karoline walked into that hearing room this morning, she wasn't trying to create a moment. She was trying to find out if the truth still meant anything in Washington. That's why the mention of the July 14th meeting hit like a slap. Because on paper, Justice Barrett had no reason to be at a pharmaceutical headquarters. But there she was, captured on internal security footage, later authenticated by a private lab, seated beside the very people her court had protected. Still, Karoline knew the documents weren't enough. She needed the country to understand why it mattered. That's why she'd held off on the memo. That was the pivot. The thing no one in that room had read yet. Because the memo didn't just summarize the meeting. It described what was agreed upon. And if even half of it turned out to be true, it wouldn't just be an ethics issue. It would be a constitutional crisis. But before that came out, Karoline had to make sure the room understood the stakes and how far this kind of influence could reach if no one stood up and said enough. Karoline didn't waste time. She flipped to the next page in her folder and let the weight of it settle in the room. "Let's talk about March 3rd, she said calmly. "That date should sound familiar to you, Justice?" Barrett blinked slowly. "I'd have to look at my calendar," she replied. Karoline gave a small nod, almost like she expected that. That was the date Nashville Pharma wired $420,000 to the Claremont Educational Fund, your husband's nonprofit. The same fund that had never received more than $15,000 in a single donation prior to that year. A soft murmur ran through the audience, but Karoline raised her voice just slightly, not to overpower but to keep control. Within 10 days of that payment, Claremont released a promotional video thanking our newest partner in public health innovation. That video, Justice, was shot inside Nashville's research campus. We verified the building layout with satellite overlays. Barrett shifted slightly in her seat but didn't say anything. Her lawyer, sitting one row behind, scribbled furiously. Karoline continued, flipping to the next document. On April 12th, your son-in-law, Dr. Kenneth Voss, was hired as a strategic policy advisor at Vireo Strategies, a firm that just happens to represent Nashville Pharma in 3 separate federal cases. Was this disclosed to the committee during your last financial review? Barrett spoke more carefully now. Family employment is not subject to the same reporting requirements under the current judiciary ethics rules. Karoline looked directly at her. That's true, but it's still relevant when you're ruling on matters involving those same entities. Again, silence. This wasn't just about one meeting. This was a web. On May 2nd, the Claremont Fund hosted a closed-door dinner at the Aspen Club in Colorado. The guest list was private until last week when someone leaked it. Among the names were senior Nashfield Pharma board members, their attorneys, and a senior legal strategist from the FDA. "Were you present at that dinner, Justice?" Karoline asked. Barrett answered after a long pause. "I've attended many professional events. I don't recall the specifics of that one." Karoline turned back to the committee chair. "Permission to submit guest logs and reservation confirmations for the record." The chairman nodded. So entered. Karoline's team had done their homework, not just public records, but flight logs, digital breadcrumbs, patterns. It was one thing to find a photo. It was another to place people together again and again in the lead up to a ruling that protected billions in revenue. Then she dropped something that made even the interns in the back sit up straight. "We obtained a procurement record from Nashfield's Public Affairs Office. It details a consulting contract signed in late January, just 2 months before the Schroeder ruling. The contract is with a company registered to a Delaware address that matches one used by your cousin's real estate firm. That firm received a $62,000 payment labeled venue coordination and legal prep." Barrett didn't respond. Karoline didn't press it. She let the facts speak. What she was building wasn't a scandal. It was a structure. Piece by piece, moment by moment, tying threads that the public was never meant to connect. The media hadn't noticed it yet. The legal world hadn't acknowledged it yet. But Karoline knew what this meant. People want to believe judges are immune to influence, that once they're robed, they're above everything. But that's not how power works. It doesn't always show up loud. Sometimes it looks like an invitation, a thank you dinner, a quiet donation passed through the right name. But the real turning point was coming, and Karoline was about to read the one document that no one in that room had seen yet. Karoline took a breath, not the kind you take when you're nervous, but the kind you take when you know everything is about to change. She held the single page up for just a second longer than necessary, letting its presence sink in. Then she placed it on the desk in front of her, flattened the corners, and looked at Justice Barrett. "This memo," she said, her voice steady, "was drafted by Nashfield Pharma's legal chief the day after your July 14th meeting. It was marked confidential and sent internally to 3 executives. The copy I'm about to read from was provided by a whistleblower, whose identity I will not disclose for their protection." The room held still. Karoline began to read. "Summary of meeting with ACB. Discussion focused on FDA liability exemptions under current public health emergency clauses. Consensus reached on benefit to maintain narrow interpretation to protect long-term development investments. ACB confirmed court leans toward textualist reading, sees public good in regulatory certainty. Follow-up advised through Claremont channels. Voss appointment seen as long-term strategy. All parties agreed on alignment." She looked up. "That's what it says, word for word." Barrett didn't move. She didn't object. She didn't ask to see the memo. Karoline let the silence stretch for another moment, then folded the memo slowly. "This is a direct account of a conversation with a sitting Supreme Court justice about a case that came before the court less than 3 months later." Someone on the committee cleared their throat, but said nothing. Justice Barrett finally responded, her voice cool. "There are serious questions about the authenticity and chain of custody of that document." Karoline nodded slightly, as if she knew that was coming. "Of course, and that's why I'll be submitting it for forensic verification, but it matches timelines, donor records, travel logs, and now, confirmed meetings." The committee chair interjected gently. "Justice Barrett, do you categorically deny that any portion of that memo reflects a real discussion you participated in?" Barrett stared down at the table for a long beat. Then, "I cannot speak to something I did not write and have not verified." She was slipping. Karoline knew the room had turned. Even some of Barrett's supporters looked visibly uncomfortable now. These weren't fringe accusations anymore. This was a pattern, a paper trail, and now a direct account, one that used Barrett's own initials. Karoline turned slightly in her chair, not to the judge, but to the room, to everyone watching. Whether or not this memo proves outright misconduct is for this body to determine, but what we're seeing is a repeated set of interactions, unreported, unexamined, that raise questions no Supreme Court justice should have to answer. And yet, here we are. She wasn't angry. She wasn't smug. She sounded like someone tired of pretending. People are losing faith in institutions. Not because of politics, but because of silence. Because every time someone says, "This is probably nothing," it turns out to be something. She tapped the paper once. "This is something." The committee chair called for a short recess. Cameras zoomed in as Justice Barrett stepped away from the table, speaking quietly to her counsel. But the image that stuck wasn't her retreat. It was Karoline, sitting still, with the memo resting in front of her like a stone on calm water. Phones lit up across the room. Reporters moved toward the hallway. Someone from a major network whispered to their producer, "We need the clip of her reading the memo, right now." Outside the chamber, the story had already broken. By the time Barrett returned, the headlines were up. The leak was real. The memo was viral. And the public wasn't waiting for confirmation. They wanted answers. But Karoline wasn't finished. Not yet. Because what came next was the moment the entire country would remember. By the next morning, Karoline Leavitt's name was trending across every major platform. Not because of a flashy soundbite, but because she had done what few dared to try. She put a Supreme Court justice on the defensive. Clips of the hearing spread like wildfire. News anchors debated it. Podcasts dissected it. Late-night shows spun it for laughs. But even the jokes felt heavier than usual. Everyone had an opinion. But what stuck with people was the memo. One page, plain and clinical, that cracked the myth of impartiality. In Spokane, Washington, a mother of 3 who'd lost her husband to complications from a drug pulled off the shelves too late was crying at her kitchen table. She didn't care about legal nuances. She just kept saying, "So they knew. They knew." In Charleston, a pharmacist who'd been skeptical of conspiracy claims texted his colleague at 2 a.m. with a link to the full video. "You need to see this. It's not noise anymore." Barrett's camp issued a formal statement before noon. It was brief, flatly denying any wrongdoing and accusing Karoline of performative politics. But the tone wasn't confident. It read like damage control. The Judiciary Committee scheduled an emergency session within 48 hours to review the new documents. Senior members of the ethics panel were pulled from scheduled travel. Behind closed doors, the phone lines were burning. Karoline, meanwhile, kept quiet. No press tour, no morning show interviews. She let the hearing speak for itself. And that silence, oddly enough, made her louder. One of the most shared posts on social media that day was a still frame. Karoline seated upright, memo in hand, with the caption, "She didn't flinch." Reporters started digging into Nashville Pharma's past donations. By the end of the day, 5 nonprofits tied to judicial family members had been linked to public health innovation grants, quietly funneled through third-party foundations. Legal scholars argued over whether the memo amounted to misconduct. Some said it was too vague. Others called it the judicial equivalent of a smoking gun. But what mattered most was the court of public opinion. People were watching, and for once, they weren't zoning out. They were paying attention, because something about the way Karoline handled herself made them feel like this wasn't just more noise. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't accused. She'd shown receipts. Even skeptics admitted they didn't see it coming. One veteran journalist tweeted, "I went in thinking it would be political theater. I left realizing I'd just watched a real-time accountability check." At a diner in Pittsburgh, 2 retired teachers, lifelong centrists, sat across from each other in disbelief. "Do you think anything will come of it?" one asked. "I don't know," the other said, "but it feels like someone finally asked the right questions." Barrett canceled 2 upcoming public appearances, one at a university symposium, the other at a legal gala in Phoenix. Her office gave no reason. Her usual defenders on cable news were slower to jump in this time. A few offered cautious support. Most chose silence. And Karoline? She sat quietly in her DC office, staring at a whiteboard with names, arrows, and post-its. She knew this wasn't over. One memo didn't fix a system, but it cracked something. And once there's a crack, people start looking closer. She checked her phone, a voicemail from a federal judge, another from a retired FDA analyst. It was happening. But just as the media tried to catch up, Karoline received a tip that turned everything on its head, and it wasn't about Barrett. By Thursday morning, the floodgates had burst open. What had started as a pointed line of questioning in a wood-paneled hearing room had spilled into living rooms, car radios, and coffee shop conversations across the country. It wasn't just Karoline's delivery. It was the way people felt after watching her. Like someone had finally said out loud what they'd all been thinking for years. If they can't be trusted to tell the truth, who can? Everywhere you looked, ordinary people, ones who didn't care for politics, who avoided anything with the word judiciary in it, were leaning in. Clips of Karoline holding the memo had been translated into Spanish, Korean, Vietnamese, and Arabic. It aired in pieces across international news outlets. Foreign analysts commented on the rarity of such direct confrontation toward a U.S. Supreme Court justice. Back home, something stranger happened. Barbershops in Detroit debated judicial term limits. Retired veterans in Fayetteville, Arkansas, shared op-eds over morning coffee. Teenagers on TikTok stitched the hearing with memes, but behind the jokes, you could tell, they understood the stakes. And then came the rallies. They weren't massive at first. Dozens here, a few hundred there. Phoenix, Bakersfield, Rochester. People holding up handmade signs. The robe doesn't make you right. We deserve judges, not sponsors. Thank you, Karoline. Some called it a movement. Karoline didn't. In private, she told her team, "This isn't about me. It's about keeping the doors open long enough for people to see what's inside." But still, it was hard to ignore the momentum. Late that night, Karoline sat down for her first on-camera interview since the hearing. It wasn't with a big cable anchor or a flashy host. It was a quiet conversation with a local reporter from Keene, New Hampshire, someone she knew wouldn't cut corners. The camera rolled. "You didn't raise your voice," the reporter said. "You didn't interrupt her. You just laid it out. Why?" Karoline took a second. "Because I wasn't trying to win. I was trying to show the country that no one, not even a Supreme Court justice, gets to hide behind a title." The reporter nodded. "What about people saying this is political?" "It is political," Karoline answered, "but it's also personal. When the decisions being made in those chambers affect people's access to medicine, to justice, to truth, it stops being just politics." She paused again, quieter this time. "There's a grandmother in Indiana who lost her only daughter to a bad drug batch. She's been writing letters for years, trying to find someone to listen. I got one of her letters last month. I read it 3 times. That's who I was thinking about in that room." The segment aired just after 11 p.m. It wasn't flashy. There were no gotcha moments, but it hit people hard. A viewer from Tempe commented, "She reminds me of when leaders used to sound like they actually gave a damn." Another from Topeka, "Not left, not right, just real." Online, opinion columnists started walking back earlier dismissals. One headline read, "The Quiet Storm, How Karoline Leavitt Tapped a Nerve the Court Didn't See Coming." Others demanded formal investigations. A nonprofit in Oregon launched a petition pushing for stricter conflict of interest disclosures for all federal judges. It passed 100,000 signatures in 2 days. Even a few lawmakers who'd stayed silent during the hearing began quietly reaching out, not to challenge her, but to understand how she got that memo, what else she had, and what she planned to do next. Karoline kept her circle tight. Trusted voices, no leaks, because there was one piece no one had picked up on yet. One part of the memo that hadn't been read out loud. And that line had the power to do more than just rattle public opinion. But before she revealed it, Karoline needed to decide whether the country was ready to hear what it actually said. It was nearly midnight when Karoline found herself alone in her apartment, the city outside humming quietly in the dark. The lights from the Capitol dome blinked through her window. She hadn't slept much in days. The memo was still on her desk. Only this time, it was open to a line she hadn't read during the hearing. One sentence, one phrase buried near the bottom of the page. Final alignment confirmed. ACB indicated future willingness on regulatory shielding, pending Claremont's continued support. That word, willingness, hit differently. It wasn't just a legal note. It was a handshake behind a locked door, a deal brokered in silence. The kind of arrangement that, if left unchecked, changes how justice functions from the top down. Karoline didn't rush to publish it. She didn't call a press conference. She stared at it for a long time, trying to decide what it meant, for her, for the country, for the people watching with cautious hope. Because by now, she understood this wasn't just about Barrett. This was about what happens when power gets too comfortable, about what people stop noticing when robes and titles start to mean more than responsibility. Back in high school, Karoline had studied constitutional law under a teacher named Mr. Dominguez, A man who believed civic education should be taught with real consequences. He'd once told her, "The second you believe someone can't be questioned, you've stopped living in a democracy." She thought of him now, and she thought of the people she'd heard from this week. A retired nurse in Fresno who watched her brother suffer after being denied treatment. A man in rural Nebraska who'd never voted before but told her he'd register just to support anyone who believed judges should answer to someone, anyone. All of it was swimming in her head when she sat down with her chief of staff the next morning. "Are we reading the rest of it?" he asked. Karoline didn't answer right away. She took a sip of coffee. Then she said, "Not yet. Not until the committee finishes their first review. I want the law to move first. If it doesn't, then we go public." Her chief of staff studied her for a second. "You're risking everything if you wait." "I know," she said, "but if this becomes another outrage cycle, people will tune it out. This has to mean something." And that's when it became clear. Karoline wasn't trying to go viral. She wasn't chasing political momentum. She was after something bigger. She wanted accountability to outlive the headline. In her next public appearance, Karoline didn't mention the memo. Instead, she visited a group of high school students in Decatur, Alabama, who'd invited her to speak after the hearing. She stood in front of 30 juniors in a government class and told them something she wished she'd heard when she was their age. "You don't have to be loud to be right. You don't have to be perfect to be honest. You just have to care enough not to look away." A girl in the back raised her hand and asked, "But what happens if nothing changes?" Karoline paused, then smiled gently. "Then you try again. That's what this whole thing's about. Showing up, even when the system hopes you won't." That clip didn't trend. It didn't blow up online. But for those who saw it, it landed in a quiet way that stayed with them. Because what Karoline had done wasn't flashy. It was disciplined. It was deliberate. And it reminded people that change doesn't always come like a hammer. Sometimes it comes like a question. A simple one, really. But the answer to that question would soon decide whether the system was still worth believing in. The next hearing came 2 weeks later. The room was even more crowded than before. Journalists packed every row. A federal marshal stood near the entrance. Every microphone had been tested 3 times. No one wanted to miss a word. Karoline arrived early. She carried no dramatic binder, no stack of new evidence, just a slim folder and the same composure that had become her signature. She greeted the committee chair with a firm handshake, nodded to a few reporters, and took her seat. When the proceedings began, the air wasn't tense. It was alert. Like everyone knew what had happened already, but needed to hear it said out loud. After some procedural statements, the chair finally addressed her. "Congresswoman Leavitt, you've asked to make a statement. You may proceed." She stood. "I'm not here to accuse. I'm not here to entertain. I'm here because when someone raises their right hand and swears to uphold the law, the country deserves to know what happens when they don't." A few camera shutters clicked, then stopped. Karoline continued, voice firm but steady. "I want to be clear. What we're dealing with here isn't just one meeting. It's not just one justice. It's a structure. A structure that's gone untouched for too long because it wears the right robe, speaks in the right tone, and signs its name with the right title." She held up the final page of the memo. Yes, that line. The one she hadn't read before. "I didn't read this part earlier because I wanted to give the system a chance to work. I wanted to believe that integrity could still be self-correcting, but it's been 2 weeks, and while the public's watching, the system has stayed quiet." She cleared her throat, then read it. "Future shielding agreement will require discretion in upcoming court opinion. ACB verbalized understanding. Communications to proceed via Claremont for reduced visibility." No speculation, no emotion, just words. Words that sounded like strategy, like manipulation dressed as professionalism. The chair sat back in his seat, arms folded. The committee clerk whispered to someone off mic. Justice Barrett wasn't in the room this time, but the shadow of her presence sat heavy. Karoline looked directly at the cameras, directly at the public. "We're told the law is blind, but when money opens doors and titles protect deals, the law isn't blind, it's bought." She took a breath and softened, just slightly. "I didn't do this to win a headline. I did it because I think we're worth more than silence. Because if our judges stop answering to us, what's left?" Another pause. No noise. Just attention. Then the final words. "I'll keep asking questions, and I hope you do too, because power only hides when no one's looking. She sat back down. The hearing continued, but people were no longer just watching. They were thinking, processing, talking. Outside, reporters lined up for reactions. Inside, committee staff began redrafting their ethics protocols. At home, citizens, many of whom had never watched a hearing in their lives, were talking about conflict of interest laws, judicial term limits, and why oversight shouldn't end at the nomination. Karoline didn't ride a wave. She created one, by refusing to accept that powerful people get a pass just because of where they sit. And that's the part that mattered most, because somewhere out there, maybe in a small town, maybe in a city no one talks about, there's a kid watching this unfold. Maybe she's 14. Maybe she's just figuring out what justice means. And maybe, just maybe, she sees Karoline and thinks, I can do that too. I can ask hard questions. I can hold the line. And that's the lesson. Not that corruption exists. We know that. The lesson is that someone has to care enough to call it what it is and stay standing when the room goes quiet. If you're still watching, ask yourself, who else isn't being questioned? Who else is hiding behind status? And who's going to speak up when it's your voice that's needed? Because silence doesn't keep the peace. It protects the powerful. Subscribe to this channel if you believe accountability matters, no matter who's wearing the robe.